I'd like to play a little game with you all, just to start with a game of Would You Rather. You know, I give you two choices, and you have to choose between which one of them you would prefer. It's kind of fun, kind of makes you think a little, kind of makes you evaluate what you value and what's important to you and stuff. For example, would you rather be an extra in an Oscar-winning movie or the lead in a box office bomb? Would you rather be an extra in an Oscar-winning movie or the lead in a box office bomb? If you would rather be an extra in an Oscar-winning movie, raise your hand. There are some people here in the room. Informal survey here. Good. If you'd rather be the lead in a box office bomb, raise your hand. Okay. Looks like some of you would rather be the lead in Sharknado 5 rather than the person drowning in Titanic. But that's good. Hey, and if you want to, feel free to comment on the Facebook chat on these questions too, if you would like. Second question, would you rather have telekinesis, that is the ability to move things with your mind, or telepathy, the ability to read minds? If you would rather have telekinesis, the ability to move things with your mind, raise my hand. Okay, moving on to the next question. Would you rather go back to... Please stop that. Thank you. Would you rather go back to the past and meet your loved ones who passed away, or go to the future and meet your children or grandchildren to be? Who would rather go back to the past and meet your loved ones who passed away? Okay, how about to the future and meet your future children and grandchildren? Okay, we got some optimists in the house, or maybe you just had bad relations with your past. I don't know. How about this? Would you rather spend the night alone in a deep, dark wood, or spend the night in a sketchy neighborhood? Deep, dark wood, sketchy neighborhood. We're about even. I guess it depends on what you'd rather face, a wild animal or a human. Okay, how about this one? Would you rather have a difficult life with a deep, profound relationship with God, or have a trouble-free life with a shallow relationship with God? You don't have to answer that. I will be honest with you on this. I would love to have a trouble-free life, but I find that the difficulties in life motivate me to pursue closer to God, a lot more than the good times. It's the hard times that really move us to pursue God sometimes. And we're going to learn a little bit from the life of somebody who had a very difficult life and had an astonishing relationship with God. We are finishing our series on God's story, our story, hearing God's call to the people of Genesis. And we're looking at the life today of Joseph. Just a quick overview. Joseph was the great-grandson of Abraham. We have Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob. Jacob had two wives, not God's preferred arrangement, but a long story, and you can check out my wife Sherry's message from last week on Leah and Rachel for a great message and a little more understanding on the background of all of that and how it came about. But in short, Jacob loves his wife Rachel, but not his wife Leah. But Leah gives Jacob children while Rachel is barren, a shameful thing for a woman in that culture. Jacob eventually has 10 sons and a daughter, and then God remembers Rachel and opens her womb, and she has a son. And they name him Joseph, and Joseph is Jacob's favorite. Sometime later, Rachel gives birth to another son, Benjamin, and then she dies in childbirth with delivering from Benjamin. So you have Joseph and Benjamin through Rachel to Jacob, and then you have 10 other brothers and a sister, or all the children of Jacob. Now, we don't hear much about Joseph after his birth until we come up to chapter 37 in Genesis. And at this point, we see the life of Joseph. He's 17 years old, and it all begins with a wardrobe malfunction. Look here at Genesis chapter 37, verse 3. Now Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. This robe was an emblem of Jacob's special favor on Joseph. Now, I'm not sure if Jacob wanted to spite his other sons with this gesture or not. He may just have wanted to splurge on Joseph. We're not sure. But imagine this. It's Christmas. There are presents under the trees. You're in the room with all your brothers and sisters. If you don't have any brothers or sisters, just pretend you do. Your father has put presents under the tree, and you begin to open them. You take yours, you open it up, and there's a fine bottle of perfume or cologne. And your brother gets a new fishing pole, a nice fishing pole with some gear and stuff. Your sister gets a nice, lovely designer outfit. Someone gets concert tickets to their favorite show. Someone gets a brand new pair of really nice shoes, and so forth, goes around the circle. Then you come to this young half-brother of yours. He opens a box, reaches in, pulls out a set of keys to a fancy new car. How would you feel? I imagine there'd be a palpable feeling of division there in the room, a split here, and instantly an us versus him mentality. Who is this guy? Here's the wardrobe malfunction. A sign of love of the father to his son, but it instantly becomes an emblem of favoritism that creates resentment, division, and hatred. Scripture says they hated him. That is, his brothers hated Joseph, and they could not speak a kind word to him. And then Joseph has a dream. Sometime later, and he comes up to his brothers and he tells him this dream in verses 6 through 8. Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around and bowed to it. His brothers understood what that meant. They said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said to them. They understood the prophetic nature of this dream. And this is the introduction we have of Joseph, this favored son in a contentious relationship with his brothers. There's tension in the family. Now, they were shepherds, and they would take their father's flocks out to graze them. And one day they had gone to graze them, and Jacob's worried about his sons, wants to make sure they're doing okay. So he sends Joseph out to check on them, to see if they're all right. Now, they had traveled quite a bit. They were about 65 miles away from home in a town or near a town called Dothan. Dothan was a town on a trade route where caravans of traders would come through. And when Joseph was a ways away, they saw him coming. And in that short time between when they saw him, they devised a plan to kill him. 37:19 through 20. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We'll say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. Now, the eldest son, Reuben, takes a little moment of nobility here at this point, a good character here, and he talks his brothers into not killing Joseph, but just leave him in that cistern. Just so you know, a cistern was sort of an in-ground storage tank for water. They dig a hole in the ground and line it, and presumably it was for the trades that would come through here. They had these cisterns. Anyways, the hole was big and deep enough that if you were in there, and this one was empty, if you were in there, you would not be able to climb out without assistance. So, Reuben's plan was to save Joseph. He was going to deliver him back to Jacob. So they threw him in the cistern, but Joseph's deliverance was not complete. Reuben saved Joseph's life, but he stepped out of the picture for a little while. And while he was away, the other brothers saw a caravan coming, and they sold Joseph as a slave to the caravan for 20 shekels of silver. That was a common price for a slave in those days. So now Joseph is a victim of human trafficking, instigated by his brothers, and he's on his way to a foreign land. Can you imagine the trauma he must have experienced? The horror, the betrayal from his own family, this happening. The anxiety and fear of being thrown in this caravan, not knowing where he was going. I'd say for him, it was at least, to say the least, scarring. Now, his brothers may have had a greater temptation to kill him, being so far from home. They wanted to rid themselves of him. They're out here in the wild frontier, and no one's going to find out. They can make up an alibi, which they do. They take his coat, they kill a goat, they take the blood of the goat, and they stain his coat. And they return home, and they present the coat to Jacob. And as they had hoped, Jacob concludes what they wanted. A ferocious beast had killed his beloved son. Now, there's a lesson here for us. Sometimes we're tempted to go outside of God's will to accomplish something we want. We sin. We may be blinded by what we're dealing with and blinded to the consequences of that sin. We may have festering emotions of jealousy, of resentment, of anger, of hate. And they could blind us not only to the wrong that we're doing, but to the long-term consequences of it as well. We may get what we want in the short term, but in the long term, it will cost us in ways we may not see. My case in point is here. In this account, as it unfolds, we'll see that these brothers bore the burden of decades of guilt for what they had done. They brought a lifetime of grief upon their father for their actions. And I'm certain that life at home was never again pleasant for them. I'm reminded of Paul's words in Romans 12, verses 19 through 21, when he tells us, "Do not repay evil for evil. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not overcome evil by evil. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." You know, you'll never regret doing something good. You may be doing good for somebody who doesn't deserve it. You may not like it at the time, but you won't regret doing something good. Now, while Joseph's family is at home grieving, Joseph's in Egypt, and a man named Potiphar purchases him as a slave. Potiphar is a captain of Pharaoh's guard, and at this point in the story, we see first off that the Lord is with Joseph. Look at Genesis 39, verses 2 through 4. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. So things are turning out pretty well for Joseph. He's in an important place. He's got a prominent role in this household of this important person. He's having success in everything he does. He's talented. He's got skills. And what's more, he's good looking. Scripture says that Joseph was well built and handsome, which brings us to another wardrobe malfunction. See, Joseph caught the eye of Potiphar's wife, and day after day, she would try to seduce him in very unnuanced words. "Come to bed with me," verse 7. But Joseph refused. He took steps to avoid her, and his words to her when approached were, "My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Now, Joseph understood there's implications if he succumbed to this temptation. Things would change, it would alter stuff. He earned the trust of his master. He earned the trust of the servants in the house. But his number one focus was on God. He was aware of God's hand on his life, and he was aware of who he needs to serve first in whatever his situation was. Now, if you're at all familiar with the story, you know what happens next. Sometime later, when there was nobody around, Potiphar's wife approaches Joseph and tries to seduce him. She grabs his cloak and, holding on to it, tries to get him to sleep with her. Joseph flees, leaving his cloak behind. Potiphar's wife hangs onto the cloak and waits for her husband to get home. When he arrives at home, she makes up a false story telling him that Joseph tried to rape her and presents this tunic, this cloak, as evidence. Now, understandably, Potiphar is enraged, and he throws Joseph into prison. So now, Joseph goes from the zenith to the nadir. He has a crime of possession of good looks and integrity. He suffers a huge injustice. And then we see again, God is with Joseph. Genesis 39, 21, and 22. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Now, while in prison, God blesses Joseph. We don't know how long he was in prison for. He had to be there for some time, long enough for him to be noticed and to gain trust and to be moved into this position of responsibility. He faithfully handles those responsibilities, and as God blesses Joseph, others are blessed as well. And soon along comes a time, a chance for his deliverance from his circumstances. He meets in prison a couple of men. One's the baker for Pharaoh, and one is Pharaoh's chief cupbearer. They were in prison because they angered Pharaoh. They were depressed. They each had a dream, and God enabled Joseph to interpret those dreams. The cupbearer presented his dream to Joseph, and Joseph explained to him the meaning of that in 3 days he'd be restored to his position in Pharaoh's court. He'd get his old job back. The baker, pleased with that report, asked Joseph to interpret his dream, and Joseph told him his dream and what it meant, that in 3 days he would be put to death by Pharaoh, which underscores the nature of the justice system they were dealing with. There's no innocence till proven guilty, no jury of your peers, none of that. If you angered the wrong person, you were in jail, and not really a way to get out. But Joseph appeals to the cupbearer, and the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph. And Joseph spends 2 more years in prison. Joseph did not get what he deserved. He is one of the few people in the Bible with no record of a sin or a major fault for that reason. Especially, at least for anyone who has this much content dedicated to them in the Bible, 14 chapters. Now, he may have been a brat, maybe as a young kid, but he may have also been somebody who was a good, responsible, loving son, and this added to him being favored by his father and all of that. And his experience going through Egypt, we see a man of good character. What this does point out is how unfair life can be sometimes. I think Joseph's experiences are not typical, but they're realistic. Thankfully, most of us don't have to suffer a prison term for a crime we did not do. But I think we can all relate to experiencing something or some time when we were unjustly treated, or when life just slapped us in the face for no good reason or anything we did at all. But God was with Joseph through it all. Now, when 2 years had passed, Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. One about 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows, and one about 7 full heads of grain and 7 thin heads of grain. And he's troubled by this dream. And at this point, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And he tells Pharaoh, hey, I met this guy in prison. He has this ability to interpret dreams. Let's call him out and have him see if he can explain to you what these dreams mean. So Pharaoh has Joseph taken out of prison, cleaned up, and brought before him. God enables Joseph to explain the meaning of Pharaoh's dream. And in 7 years, they're going to have abundance. It's an agrarian culture. That means lots of food, lots of plants, lots of grain. And 7 years of famine would follow those 7 years of prosperity. And so Joseph proposes a plan. During the 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of abundance, let's save some food, store it up, and then when the 7 years of famine come, we will have food. Pharaoh is impressed with Joseph's ability to interpret his dream. He's impressed with the plan he proposes, and he also sees that God is with him. And so he puts Joseph in charge. Now, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered service to Pharaoh. 13 years have passed since he was betrayed by his brothers. And his deliverance was still not complete. In fact, at this point, sometime during the 7 years of abundance, Joseph accepts his situation. He marries. He has some kids. He has a boy that he names Manasseh. Manasseh is a word that, it sounds like a word that means forget. As in, I forget all my troubles in my father's household. It's sort of like this child is symbolic of a turn in his life. Things have changed. This is his new life. He's putting the past behind. He has another son, and he names him Ephraim, a word that sounds like twice fruitful, because God has made him fruitful, what he says, in the land of my suffering. He accepts that his life will never be the same. He's no longer part of his family's household. He does have a new life with some joys. He's got a wife, he's got some kids. He has a great job. Nonetheless, this is all within the land of his suffering. None of this was Joseph's choice, but God had a sovereign plan. For 7 years, Egypt prospers under Joseph's management, and a superabundance of grain has been put aside for the years of famine to come. The famine comes and it's widespread. It affects the nations beyond the borders of Egypt, even to the land of Canaan. And Jacob's family is threatened with starvation. Jacob sends his 10 older sons to Egypt to buy grain. They went to the governor and bowed before him, not recognizing who he was. Now in Genesis 43, verses 6 and 7, it tells us, now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces on the ground, fulfilling Joseph's dream he had, at this point, 22 years ago. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke harshly to them. Basically, he accused them of being spies, and he devised a plan to get them to bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, back with them. He wanted to check on his father to see if his father was still alive. He didn't trust his brothers. His last experience with them didn't turn out very well and wasn't very comforting. So he had good reason to kind of yank their chain for a while. They go back to Jacob, and sometime later they return, this time with Benjamin. You see, this whole time the brothers were scared and thought they were under judgment for what they had done to Joseph years ago. Their guilt had been dogging them all these years. They still didn't recognize him. And when they return, comes the big reveal. They face Joseph, and he says to his brothers, Genesis 45:3, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified of his presence. Now, imagine you're on vacation. You're done with your vacation. You're in a foreign country. Everything's good. You just took a taxi cab ride to the airport, and you're about to get on the plane and go home. And as you arrive at the airport, you're arrested. You're dragged into a courtroom. You don't know what's going on. They're saying you were dealing drugs because they found drugs in the taxi cab you were driving in. You know you're not supposed to be there. You know you did nothing wrong, but you're sitting here, and this is a different country. You don't know the laws. You don't know the customs, and you're here, and you walk into that courtroom. And then the judge walks in and sits down at the bench, and you look at the judge, and you look at the name plaque on the bench, and then you look back at the judge, and you realize, oh, my word, this is the kid I bullied in high school. How would you feel? Terrified is a good definition or good word for that. They betrayed this man, Joseph. They wanted him dead. They sent him off, and they face him now. But they didn't get what they deserved. They got grace and forgiveness instead. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." Joseph saw the big picture. And in this, he was able to forgive and to bless. You see, God's deliverance was not in Joseph's circumstances. God's deliverance was in Joseph's circumstances, not from his circumstances. Joseph was never fully delivered from his circumstances. He was the victim of evil. He suffered injustice. But God was with him through it all. In fact, to quote W. Glenn Evans, Joseph's entire life shows how God's deliverance of his children is intertwined with the painful circumstances in which they find themselves. Joseph's entire life shows how God's deliverance of his children is intertwined with the painful circumstances in which they find themselves. God has his processes. Wouldn't it have been easier for God to just put Joseph in that position without all these setbacks? Couldn't have Joseph just gone to college, got a degree in Egyptian agricultural management, got a job and worked his way up and executed his plan? Wouldn't that be easier? Of course, they didn't have those systems and that stuff in that day. But God deals with his people in real life. His hand was on Joseph, but Joseph had to learn. If he was to lead in Egypt, he needed to learn a language. He needed to learn a culture, the customs. He needed to develop character. In short, he needed to be the best Joseph he could be for God's greater purposes. One thing that helps me with a question like this is that the Bible shows us real human experience. Wouldn't we all love to see wonderful miracles in our lives all the time? And I do believe in miracles. But most of our life is lived out in the messy day-to-day physics of life. It would be nice if God delivered us immediately out of every troubling circumstance, if we were healed the moment we began to get sick, if our financial needs were met when those bills and repairs begin to mount up, if everyone suddenly became reasonable, forgiving, and compassionate when relationships got difficult. Wouldn't that be nice? But this side of heaven, we must live in a messy world. But there is a miracle here, that our God is with us in these circumstances. I can't help but think that Paul had Joseph's experience in mind when he wrote Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That is his children, Christians. Leonard Sweet, in his book Soul Salsa, tells a story about a Native American tribe that had a very interesting way of training young braves. On the night of a boy's 13th birthday, they would blindfold him, and they would take him miles away from the village, out into the middle of a deep, dark wood, remove his blindfold, and leave him there for the night, alone. Kind of scary, I think. It's a dark wood. It is black in there. There's no moonlight, no starlight. You hear something rustling in the bush nearby. You don't know what that is. You hear a wolf or coyotes howl. There's no safe place to go to. But after a while, the dawn would break, and the sunlight would begin to come through. Not sure what that boy would see. A trail, flowers, certainly would see trees, but one thing he would see is a lone figure of a man standing there with a bow and arrow. It's the boy's father, who was there the entire night watching over him. Likewise, God is present with us in our trials. His presence is unseen, but it's real. Now consider what's going on here. This rite is meant for the boy's good, for his development. And as a parent, I can understand if I was sitting in there and I was watching my son or my daughter in that kind of situation, seeing how scared they might be, how frightened, might be sitting there crying, wondering what's going to happen. And it would be so tempting to go, it's okay, I'm right here. And at that moment, his entire experience would have been robbed from him. That chance for him to develop courage, that chance to develop independence. For this passage to work, that boy needed to know, needed to believe he was alone. And that's where the blessing to his character would come from. He wasn't, but he needed to feel that. The difference here, though, is that we know that God is with us in the woods. God is with us in the darkness. Hebrews 13:5 tells us that God has said, never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. Whatever you're dealing with right now, God is with you. I can't say why you're experiencing what you are, but God knows, and He will bring good out of it. Trust Him, look to Him. Maybe try to be aware of some of those signs of His presence with Him through your circumstances. And if you're not delivered from it as soon as you like, which I find is never, remember Joseph's life and how God's deliverance of His children is intertwined with our experiences and circumstances. That God doesn't always deliver from our circumstances, but always delivers in our circumstances. Joseph's deliverance becomes clear in the end. He was never delivered from his circumstances, but God had a greater plan of deliverance through him. There was a saving of many lives. Joseph's wise plan that he executed over 14 years saved many lives from starvation in Egypt. It saved many lives from starvation in the nations around Egypt. Most immediately, Joseph was reunited with his family, and they were saved from starvation. At this time, Jacob's family relocates to Egypt. There were 70 people in all, Jacob's sons, daughter, spouses, servants, and so forth. They settled in the land of Goshen near the Nile River Delta. There they would prosper and begin to realize fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, that he would be the father of a great nation, and through him, the whole world would be blessed. They prospered and multiplied over the next 400 years and grew into a sizable population, a nation. Then they were enslaved by a Pharaoh who did not remember Joseph. So God raises up Moses to deliver them, and they are led back to Canaan, the promised land. Sometime later, God raised up a king named David, who established the land of the people, the nation we call Israel. And David had a descendant, another man named Joseph. He had a wife named Mary who had a son. This son, too, was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. He was unjustly arrested, and he served the penalty for a crime he did not commit. And through it all, it was God's plan that through him, your deliverance would be complete.